Amen. I hope you enjoyed hearing that hymn. It's come to be one of my favorites over the last many years. I don't even remember that Christmas hymn growing up, except maybe the first line of it. I don't know about any of you, but it's an amazing hymn, and I wanted to share that with you because I also had a couple of questions for you. And did you know that good King Wenceslas was an actual person in history? So he was actually the Duke of Bohemia in around the year 900. And he was well known in his country for doing all of these great acts of goodness and kindness. And so it was pretty amazing to see what he did. In fact, it was said that he was very, very good at giving alms and food to the poor. He also made peace with countries surrounding his country, making better relations. He reformed the judicial system in his country and made it fairer for everyone. And he also built churches. And it's said that when he died, he was instantly a saint because of all the work he had done. And he's better known, in fact, in that region, not for being a king, not for being a duke, but in fact for his acts of charity and goodness towards those less fortunate. There was a man then in the 1600s, an Anglican priest named John Mason Neal, who wrote the words to this hymn. And by the way, this hymn I think has 40 verses. Well, that may be an exaggeration. It has a lot of verses. But it tells the story of good King Wenceslas and the work that he did. I think one of the reasons that John Neal wrote this was because he was very committed to his country's concept of Boxing Day. Anybody know what Boxing Day is? I used it in the children's message in the first service, and Boxing Day is a day traditionally in England and Canada where people put together boxes of food and deliver them to the less fortunate. Isn't that a great and wonderful tradition? And so John Mason Neal was very, very much a supporter of Boxing Day, and he wrote this hymn to lift up the example of charity and goodness to other people. So anyway, that's where we start today. And then I want to take a look at the scripture itself, Isaiah 61, 1-3. It's a wonderful scripture, and it begins with, as being part of what is known as the servant song. There's a section of Isaiah in which Isaiah describes what it's like to be a servant, and what really means to live with service in your heart. And this is part of that text. And in this, he talks about God's anointed one, which almost literally means God's designated one. Otherwise, God's saying, you're the one that's called to do the work of God in the world. And in this passage, we see some certain things. First of all, you should know that when Isaiah was talking about the servant, he wasn't preparing to announce Jesus coming many, many years later. He was talking about the idea that all of us, each and every one of us, are called to be a servant of God and to do it in this way. And he says, as a designated one of God, your primary job is to be a servant for the distressed and the downtrodden. This is the work of the servant, to bring good news to the poor, to bind up the brokenhearted, to release from darkness the prisoners. Those are amazing things, and almost literally in the Hebrew text, it talks about this, that we're supposed to take the broken bits of life and create wholeness again. That's a great concept for the servants of God, isn't it? A great concept for what we're called to do. We discover many, many years later, here as we celebrate Advent and Christmas, that Jesus uses this text, Isaiah 61, 1-3, as his very first sermon. That's amazing, isn't it? Later on, Jesus says to the people around him, I am singing the servant's song for you. I am one of the designated ones. One of the ones that's called to bring good news to the poor, to proclaim a great year of God's favor, to bind up the brokenhearted, and to release from darkness all the prisoners and oppressed. No matter what darkness you're a prisoner too. And so Jesus announces this as his ministry. And when he does that, he's not just announcing it as his ministry, but as our ministry. Do you wonder why, if you ever think about things like this, why can you imagine that Jesus would have chosen this for his first sermon? He could have chosen any text out of the Old Testament that he wanted. Anything. He could have preached on God's greatness and God's goodness. Anything. But instead, in his first sermon, he talked about the importance of being a servant of God. I think the reason is that this strikes at the very core of who Jesus is. Jesus is one that taught us in every way the importance of caring for others. And so as at the core of Jesus, then it becomes at the core of the community of faith. As Christians, at the core of our community of faith must be this understanding of our call to identify with and to help the less fortunate. It's part of who we are. It's a mission assigned by God. And as God gives us these kind of missions, then God equips us through God's Spirit to go into the world and be God's servants and to help those that are less fortunate. So we're assigned by God, we're equipped by the Spirit, and we're called to bring good news to the poor. It is the main call of our faith, to go out and to do this, not to count on someone else to do it, but for us to put our faith into action. There's a great story about Mother Teresa that one time she was very, very ill with a high fever, and she had a vision or a dream when she had this high fever, and when she awoke, she told of this dream that she was called in the dream, that she was right there at the entrance to heaven, standing at the gates to heaven in front of St. Peter. And she said to St. Peter, I'm tired, I'm worn out, I'm ready to come in. And St. Peter said, no, you can't come in. And so she asked him why. And St. Peter said to her, there are no slums in heaven. And you are needed to do the work of bringing good news to the poor. You see, caring for poor is every bit as much our mission and ministry today as it was in the early church, as it was for Mother Teresa. It is for us too. I found some sobering statistics this week when I was working on the sermon. I want you to hear these numbers. Worldwide, 925 million people. I want to say that again. 925 million people do not have enough to eat. Think about that. 3 million people in this country, and out of that 3 million, 40% of that 3 million are children who will go to bed tonight in a homeless shelter. The poor are with us. They're around us. So what is a person of faith, as a Christian, is our reaction to the poor, to the poverty around us? That's a great question. What are we called to do? How are we called to act? Well, if you're like most people of faith, you probably feel a little discomfort in even talking about this. You find yourself a little bit ill at ease of having to discuss this in church on a Sunday morning. In fact, some folks have grown to the point where we don't even want to interact with the poor at all. God blesses them and we ignore them. It seems to be part of that understanding of how do we deal with it? Let someone else deal with it. We want other people to take care of it, not us. But we're reminded something when we think about that. We're reminded it isn't anyone else's job. And sometimes, if that's the kind of world we live in, we hope someone else will take care of the problem so we don't have to. Can't someone else do it for us? And in fact, living in our country, sometimes we hear that if they just worked hard enough, they wouldn't be poor. If they just tried a little harder, they wouldn't be poor. Maybe if they bought better stocks, they just wouldn't be poor. And that seems to be our attitude, but we're reminded of those words of Jesus. Jesus says this, the poor will be with us always. Jesus reminds us that poverty is not a matter always of choice. Sometimes it's a matter of situation and circumstances, and we're always going to have poor. They're not going to be able to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. For some, that will never happen, and Jesus says they will always be with us. Now, by the way, when he says that, it's not so we can use that phrase as a cop-out for not helping them. Oh, they'll always be with us. We don't need to worry about it. Don't help them. In fact, he does it as a reminder that as a Christian, you have a call to help those less fortunate and those in need. Occasionally, as I was preparing this message, I always like to look at what other people are saying about a text. And I came across some things I thought, I don't know how you can get that. And I can remember several people saying, oh, well, Jesus was talking about the poor in spirit. No, Jesus was talking about the poor in finances and resources and money. And some folks would say, oh, well, if you will just give them Jesus, that will take care of them. Well, if we just give them Jesus, that's a good thing. But if you only give them Jesus, they're still hungry. And in some cases, homeless and worn out. And so giving them Jesus isn't enough. It's figuring out ways to help them. We can't let them figure it out. It's part of our job to do it. So I'm sure a few of you at least are saying, well, this is nice, but what in the world is this message doing stuck in the middle of Advent when we're looking for Christmas coming? What does helping the poor have to do with God's coming again? Where is it in relation to Advent and to Christmas? And I think it's clear for us. It's clear for us. It's a reminder. It's a wake-up call. Part of Advent is being awake, alert to what's happening around us. And so the message sometimes that we can't shut the door on poverty and poor and act like it doesn't exist, and it's not there. We're called to do that as individuals, and we're called in Advent as a reminder that we get our inspiration and we get our focus, we get our direction and our vision from the babe in Bethlehem, who said, let's proclaim a year of the Lord's favor. We're good news to the poor. And we're called to form up a community of faith that reflects that. A community of faith that cares for those that are hurting and in need. A community of faith that reaches out in love. In fact, Jesus said, if you have 2 coats, give one of them away. If you have extra food, give it away. We're called to be that kind of community of faith. And folks, it's in our spiritual DNA. Think about it. Moses talked about our responsibility to the poor. Solomon talked about our responsibility to the poor. Jesus talked about our responsibility. The apostles, the early church practiced it. Paul talked about it all the time. He reinforced this concept, this idea that we are called as Christians to reach out, to care, to share from who we are. Those of you that have been with us for the last 5 years may remember that a couple summers ago we did a movie-themed series, and one of the movies we showed was the movie Romero, which is about Bishop Oscar Romero, who worked in Latin America and who identified with the poor and preached for the poor and against government policies that were just blotting out the poor. And when he did that, he was assassinated. He was killed by government troops while serving communion in his church. He said a lot of wonderful things in his sermons, and I want to share a line from one of his sermons with us today. We must not seek the child Jesus in pretty figures of our Christmas. We must seek him among the undernourished children who have gone to bed tonight with nothing to eat. And we must have an awareness that whatever we have done to the least of these, we have done to Jesus. The call to help, the call to reach out is there for us as Christians, as people of faith. We're called to model Jesus and to remember that whatever we do to help others, we're encountering the risen Christ. One of my favorite authors and speakers is an American Baptist from the East. His name's Tony Campolo. And Tony tells a lot of wonderful stories, and he also has a lot of wonderful quotes, and I'm going to share one of his quotes with us today. Whenever you meet a suffering person, you will find out that Jesus is there, waiting to be loved in that individual. You cannot reach out to a person in need. You cannot embrace someone who's hurting. You cannot minister to somebody who is in desperate straits without having that eerie and wonderful awareness that Jesus is coming right back at you through that person. When we bring a cup of cold water, when we bring some food, when we reach out and help someone, we're not just helping that individual. We're reaching out to them and encountering the Christ in them that's already there. The church understands that Jesus identifies with the poor. And that's where we find Jesus, in the midst of poverty. As I wrap it up today, I wanted to share another Campolo story with you. And this is a true story. He teaches at a little college outside Philadelphia. But he grew up in Philadelphia, walked the streets of Philadelphia, and he tells this story of walking down the street one day, and when he did, he saw this man coming towards him, and the man was literally filthy, and he was so dirty, and he had soot on him, and he just looked, and he could tell from a distance that the aroma around the man was not good. And in his hand, he held a cup of McDonald's coffee. And as they got close together, Tony Campolo acknowledged the man, and the man said to him, "Would you like some of my coffee?" And Campolo said, his first response was, "No, it's okay, I'm fine." And as they started to move on, he said, "Hang on, I've changed my mind. I would think I would like a drink of your coffee." And so the man, dirty, filthy, smelly man, with his dirty hands crusted with oil and grease, reached out with the cup and handed it to Tony Campolo. And Campolo drank from the coffee and said how good it was. And then he said to the man, he said, "Wow," he said, "you're really generous. Why are you so generous to me today?" And the homeless man in his rags, wearing his dirty clothes, said, "Because that coffee is especially good. And I think when God gives you something good, you should share it with other people." Campolo was about ready to leave, and he said to the man, he said, "Well, can I do something for you, give you something?" And Campolo said he was thinking in his head, he could reach into his pocket and give him $5, and that's what he was planning on. The man said, "No, it's okay, I don't need anything." And as they started to part, the man said, Oh, I've changed my mind. You could give me something." And Campolo said, "Sure, what is it?" He said, "You could give me a hug." Campolo said he really wanted to give him the $5. But instead, he opened his arms and embraced this man, all of his rags and aroma and dirt. And he said, "When I was hugging him, I had a strange awareness that I wasn't hugging some homeless person. I was hugging Jesus. I found Jesus in a suffering man." The poet Denise Laverto said, "The world is not with us enough. The world is not with us enough. Oh, taste and see." Sometimes in the church, we isolate ourselves from the world around us, from those hurting, from those in need of gifts and money and food and sustenance. Advent serves as an alert, a warning, a remembrance that the world is not with us enough. Let's use Advent this year as our way to embrace the world and to share Christ, the babe in the manger, with all. Thanks be to God.